Okay, so it looks like everyone's ready. So welcome everyone to the 3Rs, Reform, Revolution, Resistance, a panel presented by the Platypus Affiliated Society. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s and 30s, new 1960s and 70s, and post-political 1980s and 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. We have a chapter at Northwestern University, which is currently online, but it's about to be in person once again. It runs a year-long Marxist reading group, coffee breaks, and public fora. You can also find the Platypus Review, our forum on print, online, at platypus1917.org, and right there in that corner. Reform, resistance, revolution. For the past 40 years, the left has defined itself in opposition to neoliberalism, primarily in terms of resistance. Following the Sanders campaign's call for a political revolution, demands for a Green New Deal, the Black Lives Matter protests from the summer of 2020, and the subsequent election of Joe Biden, the relationship between reform, revolution, and resistance for the left has been called into question. How is the left related to these categories historically? And what do these terms mean for the new left today, the left today? How can they help us understand the obstacles and opportunities for building a left adequate to the 21st century? Behind the events of the present looms the legacy of reform and resistance in the 20th century, namely the mid-century welfare reforms in industrialized countries, the rolling back of these reforms under neoliberalism beginning in the 1980s, and the resistance to neoliberal austerity, for example, the anti- and alter-globalization movements of the 1990s, and more recently after the downturn of 2008. By contrast, the legacy of revolution appears more obscure. We asked the panelists to look forward and backwards in order to understand what revolution, reform, and resistance mean for their politics today, the extent to which the past bears in the present, and how their understanding of these categories factor into how they view the future. Our panelists in order they'll be presenting are Gustavo Sanchez. He's a Bernie Campaign 2020 organizer and a member of Chicago DSA. Patrick Quinn, a founder of Solidarity US. Nick Kreitman, a labor and employment lawyer and member of the Platypus Affiliated Society, and an ex-member of the new SDS. Sadly, Timmy Chow is not able to attend as he helps run a prison education program at Statesville Prison, and which has recently gone on lockdown, so he must work today. So the way we're gonna work is we're gonna give each of the panelists about 10 minutes to give their opening remarks, and I'll signal you when you have 2 minutes left. We'll follow a quick round of responses so that the panelists may respond to each other at maximum about 3 minutes. And then we'll open up for the audience question and answer. And the audience, you'll be able to ask a question, preferably by raising your hand so you can be recognized to say the question aloud. Yeah. So without further ado, I'm gonna hand it over to Gus.
Can folks hear me? See some thumbs up, head nod in the back, perfect. Thanks for having me. Apologies, a little bit of a last minute substitution here, so I'm gonna do my best. So a little background on me. I'm involved with DSA nationally and in Chicago. I've also been doing electoral politics with Democrats and socialist candidates for years now. I'm what you call like a pollster, which our industry is dying, which is good in a lot of ways. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to focus mostly on the Bernie campaign, just because I think that's where most of my useful information can come from. So the Bernie campaign was an exciting moment, probably not what we think of as a typical revolution, but he described it as a political revolution, and that resonated with millions across the country. For example, his email list at the time was about 14 million people, which is a pretty large chunk. And he was able to get 9 million votes in the D primary out of 36 million votes that were cast. One of the most demonstrative aspects of the campaign was the number of socialist staff hired and who the money funding the campaign was coming from. Most of the money was coming from teachers, Amazon workers, Walmart workers, folks who, a lot of them were on the current federal minimum wage and still found it valuable to give the campaign money. With all this, it's good to remember that the number of people that vote in deep primaries is not that many, which is one of the reasons that we find it as one of the ways that's easiest to take power, because you don't need 100 million votes. You only need about 15 million to get a good shot at the presidency. The campaign also demonstrated the absolute limits of electoral organizing in the United States and the outsized influence of corporate media. No presidential candidate had won the first 3 primary elections in a row. I'm not going to go into Iowa, but we can later if you want. Yet the media and the establishment was still able to tank his bid for the presidency with minimal effort. Many of you may be familiar with the Obama phone call. So thinking post-Biden win, we can see that Biden has moved left somewhat based on rhetoric and his agenda, but we are nowhere near where we hope to be under a Bernie Sanders presidency. Now we are entering a period where what we can achieve through national electoral politics is extremely limited. The Democratic Party is slated to lose seats. The various programs that we've kind of put in place in the past months have made people better off, but also made them less likely to think about voting for left or Democratic candidates. So for this reason, most of us are turning our attention now to local races and kind of the redistricting fights happening in places like Chicago. In terms of opportunity for reform in the next 6 years, the most exciting developments for me are various labor activities. We have the PRO Act movement in Congress, which is okay, not great. But more importantly, we have national unions like the Teamsters who have committed to organizing around unionizing the largest and most exploitative corporations like Amazon. Teamsters now have a dedicated Amazon unit. And furthermore, we're actually making gains in terms of potentially organizing in industries that have not been organized previously. So if you think about rideshare, that's underway. In New York in particular, there are alternatives being created that will ideally be worker-owned and be able to displace Uber and Lyft now that their prices are going up. And obviously like Amazon and Walmart are key to unions. I will leave it there.
Okay. Next week, Patrick.
Thank you. I very much appreciate the invitation to speak to Platypus today. I think this is the 3rd time that I've spoken before a Platypus event, and I appreciate having the opportunity to do so. I should tell you a little bit about myself, that I've been a socialist for 61 years. I was recruited to socialism in 1960 by when I was a freshman in college by one of my professors, and that professor had been a member of YPSO, which was the Young People's Socialist League at the University of Chicago. And among his colleagues in YPSO at the University of Chicago was Bernie Sanders. So that'll give you a little bit about my background. To a certain extent, I'm returning to my home turf, that is Northwestern University. I spent 34 years at Northwestern University, so this is the first time I've been back on campus since I retired in 2008. And I think that the theme for the discussion today is absolutely appropriate for the moment, for the year 2021. That is, what is the intersection between the notions of revolution, resistance, and reform? And I think that should be really the crux of our discussion today, that all of these factors are important. We have to look at them both historically and as a guideline for activities in the present and for the prospects for the 3 of them in the future. So I think that should be the theme that we should be discussing today. Make no mistake about it, that we do need a revolution. And by revolution, I mean simply an overturning of the present situation. That is, the top will rise, the bottom will rise to the top, and the present top will fall to the bottom. That's in essence what we mean by revolution. It's much more sophisticated and we can look at historical events to amplify what we mean by revolution. But today, in 2021, the two themes that should really inform our activity are resistance and reform. Reforms are desperately needed, and resistance is the means of struggling for reform. To be sure, Joe Biden is a tremendous improvement over Donald Trump. I think there's no one in the room that would disagree with that. However, we should really also be aware that Joe Biden is a centrist politically. He is not really to the left of center in any respect. And I think we've seen this most recently by his posture toward what is happening on the southern border of the United States with all the Haitian refugees. That if Biden was more to the left than he is, that situation would not have happened. To see all those border patrolmen riding horses and using reins to whip the people down in Del Rio, Texas. I think that if one looks at the present society in the United States, one could see why a revolution is needed today, whether it's looking down at the border in Del Rio, Texas, or looking on the south side of Chicago, or looking at the thousands upon thousands of homeless people in Oakland, California, that are sleeping underneath overpasses, that are sleeping by the side of the road every day. It is absolutely ridiculous in the year 2021 to have people sleeping outside with no place to live. Now, I suspect that just about everybody in this room is enjoying life at this time and is not really in a compromised situation, that we're all very fortunate to be not only surviving, but probably prospering in 2021 American capitalist society. But we are a minority, make no mistake about it, that the vast majority of people do not enjoy the same sorts of privileges that those of us in this room enjoy today. And I hope that in the discussion that ensues from my colleagues on the panel and from people in the audience today, that we can pursue these themes further. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. Now we're going to go to Nick.
So my background politically, I came of age during the 2000s, during the Iraq War. My political experience was formed by as was told in the introduction, the resistance to neoliberalism. My participation in the anti-war movement, at the time I was an anarchist, and a lot of the political ideology and a lot of my experience was informed by what was the resistance to neoliberalism, the 1999 WTO protest movements, just the general anti-globalization resistance. So I have some insights that I'll get to from that experience. Following that formational period, I became involved in Platypus, which I feel gave me the critical distance to give me a little bit of self-awareness about what I was doing politically, what I was engaging in, and gave me a modicum of reflection that I'll always appreciate. From the time of the Iraq wars, I was in high school, I was in undergrad, I was in graduate school at the University of Chicago. From there I went to law school. In law school, I was involved with many different unions. Here in Detroit, I was in the legal department of the UAW. I've been studying the UAW and its failure to organize the transplants primarily in Ohio. I looked at Honda, but the research took me to all the different foreign automakers who were building cars in America and why the UAW couldn't organize them. That was a short stint. I ended up working for a longer period of time for a number of unions that were involved in the 70s and 80s in what I think we can talk about as reform. These are primarily African-American unions, and they primarily organized government workers or in healthcare. I worked for Teamsters Local that had been a historically black local, but had been a driving force in organizing healthcare workers at Rush Hospital and University of Chicago. I had also worked almost full-time during law school for the American Federation of Government Employees, another union local, or another union that had been formed in the 70s, 80s, as part of the tail end of the civil rights movement, where people of all colors, genders, it's a federal employer, so it was one of the first employers to wipe out discrimination, not wipe it out, but to adopt anti-discrimination policies in the workplace. And its workforce reflects that. Social Security Administration, the VA hospitals, the Department of Defense. I worked at the regional level in the Chicago office, and the majority of my local presidents were African-American women of color. After that, I did a very brief stint at AFSCME, and then had another interesting experience with the Teamsters. So let me come back to why we're here today: reform, revolution, and resistance. We're asked to comment about these categories, but I want to take a step back and talk about why we're framing them as categories. We're not talking about categories in the abstract. We're not talking about revolution and what it means. We're talking about revolution historically, and we're talking about reform historically, and we're talking about resistance historically. It's important to root these categories historically because that's what Platypus and that's what the Marxist methodology is about. It's about understanding how things occurred in history so we might be able to influence them going forward. And having that said, I think it's important to also recognize a Platypus point that I'm going to attempt to articulate, but this is the conference, so you can ask any of my colleagues in the audience for a better and more fuller articulation. But our insight is that, or my understanding of the Platypus insight, is that we have lost the ability to understand what these categories mean historically. We've lost the ability to really digest and understand what our history is in terms of political movement, and we've lost our ability to act politically. And we've lost that ability to act politically because we've lost the ability to understand our history. The two are connected. In shorthand, in Marxology, the subject-object dialectic. You're not able to act unless you understand the object you're acting on and you understand yourself. And the point of these kinds of discussions is to clear away the obstacles that prevent us from understanding our history so we may be able to act in the future. Now that being said, when I think of my experience in the Iraq War, protest movement, and my political formation as an anarchist based very much on the concept of resistance. I was a member of the Earth Liberation Front. I was a member of the Animal Liberation Front. Strong supporter of indigenous movements all over the world, stopping deforestation. A lot of struggles that were going on against neoliberalism. Looking back on that experience now, the term resistance itself means opposed. And I don't think it's a category historically that's been rooted in the left. I think if you look historically, what is resistance? Well, traditional society has always resisted capitalism. It's always resisted modernity. There's always been a struggle of resistance somewhere in the world with traditional society, whether it was in the Americas, resisting integration into capitalism, and this isn't a comment to say that, the manifest destiny wasn't a tragedy, but it was an act of resistance from the people who lived here. China resisted the European powers coming in. Same with nearly every corner of the globe has had resistance at one point or another. And I feel like the resistance that the category, the self-understanding of resistance, and my participation in this sort of moment of resistance to neoliberalism, that self-understanding tied itself back to that history of resisting capitalism. And I feel like it's inadequate to leftist politics, because what exactly are you identifying with in terms of resisting modernity and capitalism? Well, at some fundamental level, you're identifying not with a project of freedom that's a potential within modernity, but you're looking back into the past. That recognition of the past, I think, is obscure within people who claim, the title of the resistance. But B, I think it also obscures their ability to act politically now, because they are tending to adopt, they end up making very similar missteps because of this identification with an anti-modernity. And in my particular experience, it manifested itself with an identification with the resistance to the American occupation in Iraq. And I feel like identifying with that resistance hamstrung the ability of the American anti-war movement to develop into a truly political movement, at least some segments of it. Because the resistance in Iraq that we found out after 10 years was not a political movement, it was a resistance to modernity. And again, this is not trying to abrogate the responsibility for America going in and slaughtering people. But the slaughter was also being committed by what were termed as the resistance fighters. They were trying to impose some kind of, pre-modern religious society, which we found out very clearly with ISIS. And the historical roots for this kind of dynamic between people who don't understand themselves politically as the left and identify as resisting America or modernity, I think you can stretch it back further. You can look at what happened in Iran. You had the same identification with resisting American imperialism in Iran when Shah fell, and we got the mullahs in Iran. And I feel like it's a category that emerged out of the collapse of the left and the Second International, and the slow decay of the socialist project. It was engendered in the New Left as a reaction to the fall of the socialist project. And I feel like you can tie many different strings that's going to take a lot more than 8 minutes to different movements within the New Left that identify as resistance, and seeing how the connection to pre-modernity is problematic. And of course, as a side note, I'm a socialist, and for socialists, I do feel like we're taking a gamble that modern society has potential for freedom within it. But we could be wrong about that gamble, and perhaps maybe the traditionalists, the resistance, the indigenous societies who are resisting modernity have a point, and maybe there is no possibility for socialism within capitalism, and the society that they're advocating is actually more just, more kind. Maybe that is the society we need to save the earth. However, I do feel like as socialists who recognize the potential for freedom within our current society, we do have to object to that kind of traditionalism, and it is its own sort of struggle. Now, in terms of reform and revolution, I feel like just to bring it to my experience within the labor movement, certainly the labor unions I worked for were, Okay, well, maybe I'll just try and interject it with questions, but, I feel like reform and revolution outside of the context of a political party that is moving forward a project of the self-understanding of history, the terms are not terribly meaningful. Reform and revolution, I mean, yes, Bernie Sanders had a revolution, in his name, the Our Revolution organization. And I was curious that it was revolution instead of reform because he points to FDR as the historical example. And FDR was self-consciously reacting against the revolution. And,
That's it.
Okay, and I'll get to that in the comments.
Thank you, Nick. All right, so next we'll have the panelists. Now we're going to have some time for responses for all of you guys to respond to each other. Just some things I'd like to point out that maybe help direct some of it. So I noticed, Gus, for example, you point out the Bernie Sanders campaign called itself revolutionary, and Nick points it out at the end as well about it calling itself that, but the question is, why did it not call itself reform? Maybe you'd like to speak on that. Patrick, I noticed also Nick pointed out perhaps it's possible the resistance is not a category for the left, but actually one of traditional society, or one of anti-modernity. And you also pointed out in your talk that what we need right now is resistance to achieve reform. Maybe you'd like to speak on that. And Nick, maybe the same, that you'd like to address Patrick's comments on that. But yeah, we're going to start with Gus first.
Okay, great. I really like your prompt, so I think I will start there. I think that feeds into what the other folks were saying as well. So, yeah, Our Revolution is a very funny organization. One of the obvious reasons it's called Our Revolution and not Our Reform or Our Resistance or anything like that is reform is just not a very sexy word. You say that to voters and they're like, that's kind of lame. I think revolution, the word brought more kind of urgency and difference. I think Nick is totally right that absent of history, you can't really understand these terms. And to be honest, the way we use all three of these words currently are not, nowhere near their historical meanings. I mean, they've essentially lost meaning. One of the more interesting things is more recently under Biden's presidency, Our Revolution has really rebranded as more of a centrist organization. It's even less revolutionary today than it was. And I think part of this is that as Bernie gets older, you can see him pivoting to a more get along with everybody else strategy, as opposed to his kind of 2016 peak of antagonistic Bernie going after the party. So that is very much going to leave a vacuum, and I'm very curious to kind of see how that plays out in the near future. One thing, is it okay if I direct a question to Patrick?
Yeah.
Okay. So one question I had for Patrick. So you said that reforms are desperately needed and resistance is the means to struggling towards them. I'm curious to understand more what you think the modern relationship between reform and resistance is. How does resistance play into the reforms that we need, and are there actions and opportunities that could actually materialize?
Well, you ask a very good question, and I think that I'm going to try to attempt to respond to it by again going back into the past, and I'm talking here about the recent past, the last 60 years. My politics were formed in the context of two aspects of resistance, of struggle. One was the civil rights movement, and the other was the movement against the war in Vietnam. Those were the two circumstances or situations that really informed my politics and propelled me to the left. I was in the civil rights movement. I was down at Selma, Alabama in 1965, and learned really what resistance was all about. I learned it from not only observing what was going on, but participating in what was going on. And then after that, I was in Madison, Wisconsin during the height of the radicalization of the 1960s. And what really drove that radicalization was the movement against the war in Vietnam. At the same time, I was active in, like Nick, in the labor movement. My first union was in 1959 in the National Association of Letter Carriers, because I was then working for the post office and delivering the mail. After that, I became active in various other unions, primarily in AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees in Madison, Wisconsin. In AFSCME Local 1, which was the first AFSCME local in the United States. I was a member of the executive board. In Local 171 was the largest union in the state of Wisconsin before the Republicans eviscerated the union movement in Wisconsin. So based on those kinds of activities, and particularly based on my activism against the war in Vietnam, where I became one of the leaders of the anti-war movement in Madison, Wisconsin, I learned really the intersection between these three R's that we're talking about today. I learned, of course, from the study of history, that revolution was a historical event, and that the entire left in the United States was descended in the main, the large bulk of the left, from the year 1917 and the Russian Revolution. That situation is no longer the case. That historical period, in my judgment, lasted from 1917 up until about 1989, and we're in a new period now. We're not looking necessarily back to the revolution of 1917 in Russia. So we're looking at a new situation. The present situation calls for new types of strategies. It calls for a different intersection between the three R's that we're talking about today. As I say, revolution is still very much needed, but it's not on the agenda today. And it will not be on the agenda until at least the majority of people, or pretty close to the majority of people, support the notion of revolution. So that means by default that we have to be engaged now in the struggle for reform. And there's nothing whatsoever wrong with the struggle for reform, because reform does not happen in and of and by itself. It comes out of struggle, and that is the case as has been demonstrated historically, whether it was during the 1930s or the 1960s. That reform is really an aspect of resistance. That is resistance to capitalism, resistance to the powers that be, and resistance in every manifestation. So one would have to take a look at those things. So I can speak from my own experience, as I say, in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and the labor movement, and talk about what I think should be going on now.
And
Okay, so let me begin by the tail end of where I left off, and I think this is important context for my comments on the other two panelists' remarks. I'm approaching this, this topic from the standpoints of self-understanding. I talked about resistance as part of what is the self-understanding of somebody who's engaged in resistance. They have a prefigured idea of what they want in opposition to modernity. I would characterize it, from my experience of dealing with many people in the labor movement who were my elected superiors, who were actively involved in the civil rights movement, actively involved in the wave of unionization that followed the civil rights movement, as militant reformers. I don't think they're resistance. I mean, they were looking to reform capitalism. And to the extent you could call them revolutionary, I think revolution's a tricky term in modernity, because modernity itself is revolutionary. It's constantly in a state of revolution. And that was sort of the point I was going to try and sneak in at the end of my remarks, is that maybe the Our Revolution label is more insightful than we may give it credit for. Because yes, it's calling for a revolution, but it's calling for the same revolution that happens every day in capitalism. And revolution in capitalism isn't just the revolutionary new iPhone. It's the reorganization, dramatic reorganization of society. And we certainly saw that with neoliberalism. These revolutions that happen in capitalism have material reasons. And the failure of the new left and where we ended up in the 90s with anti-globalization devolving into resistance from reform. I would put it that reform, the militant reforms of the 60s, the self-conscious understanding of trying to reform modernity to make it more inclusive and more just. I feel like that was a more advanced self-understanding, which is itself regression from the revolutionary understanding that I wouldn't put to the post-1917 period. If we're talking about American politics, I would put forward that it was actually prior to 1917. 1917, the Russian Revolution was a failure out of the gate. It was an attempt to start a revolution in the countries that had capital. It was an attempt to start a revolution in Germany. America's revolution was taken off the table with the Red Scare and the deportation of tens of thousands of politically minded individuals in the immediate aftermath of 1917. Let me return to the militant reform self-understanding to the resistance self-understanding. I feel like that's part of the natural collapse of most of the institutions of the New Left. And in my experience, these unions were riddled with corruption. I went into workplaces where workers hadn't seen a contract in 10 years. And the long-term business agents before me had been sleeping with nursing home administrators. You turn on the TV in the last 2 years, and you're going to see almost every vice president at General Motors being indicted for taking bribes during negotiations with GM, with Chrysler. This is what the American labor movement, this is what the self-understanding of reform has come to. And part of this internal revolution of capitalism in the neoliberal age was part of that. And now we're seeing a swing back to unions. But if we're talking about a revolution, we need to have a self-understanding of how to overcome this relationship of ourselves to society as selling our labor and our time to have a right to exist. So that, I'm running out of time, but I feel like that's the key point in terms of a revolutionary understanding, is how do we organize history and our politics, and that, according to Lenin, within the confines of some organization, of some kind of party, and how do we engage in politics to overcome this historical problem that we have with reform and resistance and capitalism's own revolutions.
Okay. Before we get to Q&A, just for posterity, I'm so curious. Patrick, how would you directly respond to Nick's point that perhaps resistance is antagonistic to what the left has historically aspired to? I'd also like to point out, to preface this, in Rosa Luxemburg's Reform or Revolution, she makes an argument not for one or the other, but that the struggle for revolution generates the possibility for reform. If now isn't the time for revolution, is it possible that reform that would help the struggle for socialism is not possible?
You want me to respond to that? Well, I think that there's an interrelationship between these sectors, so to speak. That I think that one can struggle for reform, and it requires struggle. There's no question about it, and that reforms are worth struggling for. And I think that that is a key element of what we are confronting today.
So now we're going to open it up to Q&A from the audience. Please speak up so we can hear you. And you can address everyone or specific people. But yeah, we'll just open it up. You first.
Thank you, all, for speaking. My question is for Patrick about thinking about reform, resistance, revolution, since you were politicized in the 60s versus today. And you mentioned that since 1989, it's almost like revolution has been taken off the table with that historical shift. And I thought that was really interesting, and I wanted to know, if you could talk more about that. So, like, in first of all, like before '89, what was your political, like, what was taken for granted about your political organizing that allowed you to think about revolution? And then after '89, what changed? And then also, I mean, your organization, Solidarity, like registered that shift at the time really differently. Like it thought of '89, the collapse of the USSR, as an opening for the left, right? There was the sense that Stalinism was the stranglehold on the left, and that '89 would present an opening. That's what Solidarity, that's the name, right? So how were you right or wrong with that appraisal in '89? Was that and how have you changed? Or like, because it seems like you're saying something kind of different now, or maybe not. So please.
Well, I don't think I am saying anything really quite different. That after '89 meant that we didn't necessarily have to look back to 1917. That we were in our own context, so to speak, now, and that we had to respond to the needs of the moment, and I think that's what Solidarity is all about. That it engages in struggle in the labor movement, in organizations like TDU, the Teamsters for a Democratic Union, or Labor Notes, the publication of the left-wing labor movement. Those things correspond to the objective needs of the present situation. I would like to ask Nick to really elaborate on what he means by modernity, because I have not a clue what the hell he's talking about. This has got to be some kind of abstruse, philosophical concept, I think. I mean, the reality of the moment in 2021 is 2021. We can look to the past, to be sure, for lessons, both on negative and positive lessons. We don't have a vision of the future per se. Revolution may well be on the agenda at some point in the future, but it's certainly not on the agenda today.
I think the clearest example I could give is the city of Kabul in August of 2021, where women could walk outside, they could attend university, they could hold employment, and September 2021, where they're now beaten for walking outside without traditional wear They've been removed from places of employment. They've been prohibited from attending school. And that's just the most extreme example. But there is definitely a non-modernity that's rooted in traditional society. And of course, there's no single way to define traditional society. It just is pre the condition of capitalism, where you sell your time and labor for money, and then you're a consumer and you can make your own individual choices.
I have a point of clarification. So I don't mean to throw another R in the mix, but the idea of reform, I feel like today a lot of activism groups, especially young people, are see reform as not something reform is something that continues to uphold the status quo, the current system that we're not looking to do. And the juxtaposition between reform and abolition. And I guess R word that I threw in there is restructuring. I guess just in terms of how you guys are talking, when you talk about reform, are you including the idea of restructuring society reform? Can reform in your guys' mind include restructuring? If not, what would the term restructuring add to the discussion? Just examples that I'm thinking of, indigenous calls for land back, which could actually be encouraged in society, questioning the nation state, prison, police abolition, versus things that continue to uphold system of capitalism like reform.
All three of you could respond.
Well, I don't know. I think you'd have to really articulate a little more extensively what you mean by restructuring. I don't know what you're talking about in that regard. If it means a reorganization on some level of capitalism today, is that what restructuring means? Does it mean? I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that. So,
Yeah, just in terms of leftist organizations and leftist movements, the police and prison abolition movement, calling for we don't need prisons, specifically restorative justice, transformative justice. That's not reform. That means the criminal justice. Our goal is for the criminal justice system as it exists to not exist, and therefore it needs to be completely restructured in a way remade. So that's what I mean by restructuring versus reform, where you're just changing the system versus fixing the system versus changing the system.
I think we're dealing with terminology here.
Yeah.
I would call that radical reform. The changing of certain aspects, certain facets of institutional facets of contemporary society. Could be restructured or radically changed, but I think it's a terminological problem.
I'll quickly respond. I don't want to take up too much of the panel's time, but I would remark, specifically on the issue of, police in society. There weren't police in pre-modern industrial society. They were an outgrowth of the Industrial Revolution that drove slavery, that drove this class divide, where now you have a class of workers, and more importantly, for the criminal aspect, a class of people who are unemployed, who are part of society but aren't. And the police are there to keep them in line, and then if the working class becomes militant, to put them down too. And originally they were there to chase runaway slaves. So I do think that there's important historical connections to the police abolition movement, and in terms of what reforms to take up as a revolutionary politics, I think we need to be able to be open to all of them. I mean, just because we are revolutionary doesn't mean we don't participate in reform movements. And neither does Platypus have any advice necessarily in terms of how to act politically, how to struggle. It's the insight that we're trying to advance is more about our self-understanding of what we're doing when we do these kinds of political engagements.
A remark real quickly. So I would say that my definition of reform is wider. I do consider kind of like petty reforms and radical reforms to be all under the same umbrella. And often we can use the word reform politically to sneak more radical things through than otherwise because it's a less scary word. And like one quick example related to the land back statement you made. So, I do a lot of Puerto Rican politics, and right now we're trying to reform PROMESA, which is like the austerity imposing bill. We use the word reform publicly because it's less scary, but what the bill language that Congress will vote on is abolition language, right? It's truly the total dissolution of the board, with then the ultimate next step being like a free and socialist Puerto Rico, right? But that's not how we talk about it because that's pretty scary to Americans.
I'd like to ask all the panelists how they understand a revolution, specifically socialist revolution, because I feel on the panel there's general lack of clarification on this subject. For example, Gus has talked about how Sanders' Bar Revolution was more of a marketing gimmick, right? It was sexier, while Patrick Quinn gave a definition of revolution in terms of the top going on the bottom and the bottom going on the top. But I would like to challenge this because this sounds like a very abstract definition of revolution. We could say, such revolutions happened in pre-modern societies, and also the bourgeois revolutions, like the American and French revolutions. This seems to also be an apt description. I wondered how they would specifically define a socialist revolution. And I'd like to add on that, how do they see their reforms contributing to such a socialist revolution? Because there seems to be agreement that we need our reforms and resistance, but I struggle to see how, without a clarification of what it means to undertake a socialist revolution, how we can even explain why these reforms are leading to socialist revolution. That's all.
Well, you posed some very good questions. I think that by revolution, we really mean an overturning of society as it presently exists. Right now, 1% controls this society. Make no mistake about it. All you have to do is take a look and ask how much in taxes the 1% in this country spend. Virtually none. They don't spend anything. And they are those who are opposed to any kind of really redistribution of wealth in this society, any kind of leveling in this society. And when we talk about revolution, we mean an overturning of that kind of posture where it's pyramidical, with the 1% at the top and then the masses at the bottom. In that particular instance, that's what we really mean by revolution. The term itself has been used very widely, like the American Revolution. It means a revolution of independence from England, for example. But we're talking about a social and economic revolution now. That is a fundamental restructuring of society to where presently the wealthy no longer control that society. That's what we're talking about. The French Revolution was different than the American Revolution. The French Revolution had a social content, a social dimension to it. It had to do with much more of a leveling, of enfranchising the masses, as opposed to the American Revolution, where not very much occurred in that respect. And I say that because one of my ancestors, Captain Abel Dinsmore, was a leader of a regiment during the American Revolution. But it did not fundamentally transform the nature of society in the United States. But I think when we're talking about revolution today, we're talking about a fundamental dislocation of the current arrangement of society?
Well, I'll jump in. For my understanding, it boils down to a phrase that doesn't translate into English very well, that Marx said. Dictatorship of the proletariat. That's what the revolution's about. It's a restructuring constitutionally of a society that's already working class. This is not a society that's dominated by, these evil capitalists. It's the self-domination through our participation in this relationship we call work. And it's not embodied in particular people, it's embodied in capital. And these revolutions constantly, these capitalist revolutions constantly reconfigure but reproduce the same domination of the working class to this abstract notion of capital, where you are constantly forced to sell your time to exist and participate in society. And what revolution in that context, drawing all the way back to the liberal revolutions, England, America, France, it is the same project. It's the project for self-governance and a very liberal idea that the individual should have the freedom to determine their own fate. And they shouldn't be bound by this relationship to capital. So it would include universalizing everybody to be a worker. Everybody works, and attempting to reframe politics to address the question of how do we overcome this relationship to work? How do we reduce this requirement to participate in society where we can advance the cause of our own self-determination and self-governance as individuals? So it's raising the consciousness of society to the point of, how do we debate? I don't believe, Marxism or socialism has any predetermined outcomes. It doesn't tell you how to raise a family. It doesn't tell you, how to structure a company or industry or something. Those are questions that are going to be decided through the process of politically achieving this kind of revolutionary reordering of society, where we are bringing the main political question to the stage of we're all workers. How do we stop being? How do we overcome this concept of work?
Make one quick statement. So, I think everyone has kind of noticed that we all speak about revolution fairly vaguely. I agree very much with Patrick that I think the historical possibilities of revolution are basically off the table today, and this is one of the reasons we have discussions like this, is to kind of investigate the potential and try and understand what's gone wrong. I will say that reforms have two major benefits in my view. So the first benefit is you usually do win some sort of bettering of somebody's life for some period of time. I think that's worth it in and of itself. But the second piece is that we've been increasing what I call socialist curious people, right? So DSA roles have grown, through the struggle for a small reform that's then won, people realize we have some power, and also they're introduced to at least some strains of leftist thought, which then can kind of grow over time. Most people come into socialism through some moment or some event or something that they're going for reform in the short term, and then it leads them to socialism.
So this question is for Gus, but other panelists can feel free to jump in. Patrick. So you said that revolution is off the agenda today, and I think it'd be hard to disagree with that. So my question is, what is needed to put revolution on the agenda, and what lessons might we take from the history of the left in the 20th century?
Well, you ask a difficult question. There isn't much that we can do to put revolution on the agenda today. That's not something that's going to come out of our own volition. That whether revolution moves to center stage will depend upon circumstances and upon the failure, the abject failure of capitalism to deliver the goods to the majority of people. In that respect, that will propel a revolution, more to the center stage in this instance. So it's not something that we can will forward or wish to move forward. It depends upon circumstances. A classic example from the past is the 1930s. The 1930s represented the most significant failure of capitalism in its historical period. That propelled the notion of revolution as an alternative to the arrangement of society during the 1930s. That is not the case today. It'll have to take circumstances like developed during the 1930s, some kind of circumstances that are that broad and that inclusive to bring the question of revolution more to the center stage, I think.
So, as we're speaking about like historically and our perception of socialism today, I wanted to hear individually your thoughts on one of the failures that we've seen is like leadership within socialism and the revolution of it. And so I wanted to know, what do you guys think is a way to keep some sort of ethical liability on society rather than these where you seem like I'm sorry if I thought that very clear, but like for example in Russia, we saw the way this social revolution led to sort of dictatorship. How do we lead to revolution without that same sort of icon? Which is a kind of question, I expect.
I don't have an answer to your question, but I can tell you from my own experience that during the 1960s, I was a socialist candidate for the state legislature in Wisconsin. I was on the ballot, and I went around the area and around the state speaking on behalf of socialism, explaining what socialism was. That really impressed me. It had an impact upon people that I talked to. At first I didn't really think that would be the case, but to my astonishment, it did prove to be the case. So I received a lot of support that I didn't think that I would ever get. And I think that even today, in a much more modest manner, that talking about socialism will have an impact. To give you one minor example, I have a friend of mine who's a house painter, and he was what we would characterize as a left liberal. He was on the far left wing of the Democratic Party. So I gave him a copy of the DSA publication, the Democratic Socialists of America publication, and that the little activity did propel him into considering himself as a socialist. So that's a minor kind of a thing, but it's nonetheless important. I think as I look back on my own evolution, I think there was minor things like this, like the fact that I did luck out to have a professor who had been a socialist in the 1950s, along with Bertie Sanders at the University of Chicago, to bring socialism to me. So there are no easy answers. I think that it's going to take a broad panoply of circumstances.
So I would direct your attention to 2 points. First, I feel like the emphasis at 1917 and Stalin as the turning point for the failure of communism and how to keep leadership accountable misplaces historical emphasis. And I would direct your attention first to what happened before 1917. And I do feel like this is going to be a plug for the Platypus reading group. Because the history of the Second International, that was the global socialist movement of the Congress of national parties cooperating internationally, is really the starting point from where you want to address this question. And it's really not 1917, but rather the beginning of World War I, where you had the world's largest, most organized, most ingrained in society socialist party in Germany that the world has ever seen before or since. And there were these same questions about how do we reform capitalism to get to socialism, or do we have a revolution to get there? It's not the same question that we're talking about today. This is in a very different historical context. But ultimately, the reform camp won out and ended up voting for the war credits to initiate World War I. And that's what caused the splits that caused communist parties as opposed to just socialist parties. And that's what caused sort of the last-ditch attempt at revolution. The revolution in Russia was not where the revolution was supposed to be. It was supposed to be in the core of capitalism in Germany. And the revolution there had failed after the betrayal of the payday. And you were left with sort of a runt state. And I'm not sure if there's a good answer to whether or not 1917, post-1917 Russia would have never have gone into some kind of authoritarian dictatorship. I mean, I've been talking about modernity and examples of it. I'm pretty sure if you throw a dart at the nation of Russia in 1917, you're going to hit somewhere on that enormous country, that enormous landmass, and probably 95% of it is going to look pretty pre-modern to you. And add on top of that, millions dead because of war. Add on top of that, starvation, and you're going to get some kind of policy where it's policing breadlines. And certainly, this isn't to excuse Stalin. I'm more interested in what Trotsky had to say in terms of the opportunity of re-leveraging Russia to, again, attempt a revolution where there was capital, where they had money to pay people to eat. So, these are the questions we do grapple with, and you are getting to a very important point that I think we need to work through historically if we are going to be able to credibly, advance a socialist politics and address these questions, because certainly anybody who is coming from the Soviet bloc has a personal experience, their family has personal experience with socialism, with communism, and being able to digest that critically and historically is essential for political action.
I think you posed some very good questions, about what happened in Russia, about the period between 1917 and when the Stalinist dictatorship exiled Trotsky and brought the revolution in the Soviet Union to an end. I think that those are historically explainable circumstances. And certainly the things that you talk about the lack of food, the lack of other advances in the revolutionary period from 1917 and on are important. But the key that you point out was with all the socialism in all of the organizations, particularly in Germany, that was when World War I started, they all supported the war. There were very, very few. That's why the Communist Party came to the fore, really, because of the betrayal of the socialists at the onset of World War I. And that, unfortunately, that's really what happened, that it took a long time to recover from that betrayal.
Patrick, when you're talking about your political activity in the 60s around the war and the civil rights movement, and when you were politicized at the University of Chicago with this professor, by the way, who was the professor? What were you reading? But also, like, how did the Soviet Union figure in your mind and in your politics and political activity at the time when you were, like, if you could talk about that. What was the meaning of the Soviet Union in the 60s for leftists?
For me, the Soviet Union, did not mean very much. The name of the professor, by the way, was Jim Flynn. He now lives in New Zealand. He's still alive in that respect. I was never imbued with what you call Stalinism or the Communist Party. Never whatsoever. The first thing when we organized the Socialist Club at the university where I was, the first thing we did was we invited the mayor of Milwaukee, who was a socialist, Frank Seidler, to come speak to us. And then we invited people who had been involved in the civil rights movement to come speak to us, that kind of a thing. So I wasn't imbued with the Soviet Union per se at all. It would seem to me irrelevant.
So then could you talk about how '89 was a significant turning point for you?
Well, it wasn't for me, because I still consider myself a socialist. I just understood that there was a different period, that that from now on we didn't necessarily have to look back to 1917. This was a new period, but the nature of capitalism remained the same, and our task remained the same. That is the removal of capitalism as a social and economic unit.
I have a question for Nick. You were mentioning the rise of traditionalism in other countries, in Iraq and Afghanistan. What do you propose is the correct left-wing response to the rise of traditionalism and the far right in the USA in the last 2 decades as a reaction to modernity? Because from my perspective, the left wing has failed to react to that in any meaningful manner, especially in the last 5 years or so.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, tactics or campaigns to get involved in, unfortunately, I just don't have any good options. I mean, certainly we're going to see what happens if the Supreme Court reverses Roe v. Wade with the Mississippi law coming out. That is sort of the dark horse that I think may have been teed up to seriously ruffle some feathers. Now, in terms of combating right-wing, authoritarianism in America, the Proud Boys or traditionalism, with the wave of anti-women legislation, including in Texas and whatnot. I think, in terms of socialists, I think we need to support, because essentially socialism is liberalism. It's realizing the promise of liberalism. So, obviously, whether you're man, woman, or any gender, these laws concern you. Or us, and we need to fight them. But I feel like rather than sign up for the next canvassing shift for whatever organization is going to be soliciting money, and that's a very low blow, but more or less, that's what the Democratic Party is going to be sending out mailers on for the next 10 years. God forbid if that case gets overturned. I think it's our responsibility to do what we can, but more importantly, our emphasis needs to be on our own self-understanding of our own politics and how to engage it, because obviously the resistance to the anti-women legislation going on in primarily in the American South, led by the Democrats, has been a complete failure, and that's why we're here.
I have a question. So I'm from Kazakhstan, from post-Soviet Union country. So my question is, I think like if we would go in Almaty, Kazakhstan, and ask people if they want to go back to socialism or the Soviet Union, I mean, the economy in Kazakhstan is not great, not good, but it is better than when it was Soviet Union. So my question, I guess, is what would be like 3 key points you would tell these people why they should go back to socialism or Soviet Union? Like 3 key points.
Well, the first thing is there wasn't socialism in Kazakhstan or in the Soviet Union. Make no mistake about it. That was a Stalinist regime. It had nothing in common with socialism. That was the case going back to the 1920s when Stalin, consolidated power. You could forget about socialism in the Soviet Union after that period.
I have another question then. What's the difference between socialism and communism?
Well, that would take the rest of the excuse me, afternoon to talk about. It depends what you mean by communism. If you talk about what Karl Marx was talking about with communism in the Communist Manifesto, that was good stuff. If you read the Communist Manifesto, if you talk what communism meant in the 1950s, by that time it had become coterminous with Stalinism, with a regime that Stalin had implemented in the Soviet Union at that point. So, socialism and communism at one point were dovetailed the same. Where it began to diverge was what happened in the Soviet Union after Stalin took power, and socialism, continued in many respects, but it became primarily social democracy. That is, a left wing within the context of capitalism.
So, Olya, I would discuss first and foremost the best parts of the change that's happened in Kazakhstan. The best parts of the change. People are more free to express themselves than they were under the Soviet Union. Obviously not free now. It's an authoritarian regime that has, some economic development, and as a developing economy, they allow some kind of expression. I think the other panelist is right. You have to be able to explain the history of what happened to the Soviet Union and the premise of the question, why return to the Soviet Union? He's right, it's not socialism, but it's also what happened on the entire world historical stage. What brought about the Soviet Union as it existed, for Stalin to come and murder millions of people in the name of socialism and communism. I would rather root, any kind of socialist tradition and Marxism in the same kind of liberalism that has been the best of American society, of European society, of any kind of modern society. The right for individuals to govern themselves. And it's about the workers taking control of their work and society in order to reduce the amount of time they're working for somebody else, or they feel like they're working for themselves just so they can put food on the table. That's what it's about. It's about freedom rather than opposition to something, resistance to something. Because honestly, we've been talking about resistance, and probably the best example of resistance politics I can give is, and the regression from freedom that represents, is the Soviet Union. It became an ideology of anti-Americanism, resisting American imperialism, and we've seen that in so many examples through every regression of Stalinism, whether it's the USSR or China, and we still see it on Russian language TV where we're resisting American imperialism. When it's really just, promoting the more traditional, kind of the worst aspects of society in opposition. For example, Stalin, when he took power, removed the rights of gay marriage and the right to be, to determine your own sexuality, because he was trying to restore, in opposition, he was resisting the corruption of the West and of modernity and appealing to sort of the peasant mentality.
Actually, my question is directed at Gus and Patrick, although I also, if Nick would also like to respond, that'd be great. Gus, I'm curious what you think about Patrick in terms of his organization of Solidarity, which still ostensibly attempts to build a mass socialist party and also has influences of Trotskyism. And I'm also curious, Patrick, what you think about Gus's participation in the Chicago DSA and also his campaigning for Bernie Sanders, especially in our current moment where the DSA mostly attempts at left pressure, pushing Biden to the left. So of course they can also respond, but I'm curious what you think about your two different forms of politics.
Yes, I'm a member of DSA, and in DSA there now exists various currents. Some are more oriented toward the Democratic Party. I disagree with those currents entirely. I think that's bullshit, to tell you the truth. And it's a means of self-destruction. There are other currents within there that are for socialism and much more revolutionary in that regard. As for Bernie, I would not have campaigned for Bernie per se. I did vote for him, because I considered the alternatives at that time. There was a really very little socialist alternative in that respect. But I think that the debate is going to continue within DSA between a revolutionary perspective and a reformist, pro-Democratic Party orientation. Bernie Sanders should know better. He comes out of a Trotskyist socialist background. He knows what the score is. But he became an independent in Vermont, still to avoid being in the Democratic Party. But once he got elected to the U.S. Senate, he has to relate to the Democrats, and he participates in the Democratic Party caucus and so on and so forth. Even though he knows he shouldn't, he considers it that his only alternative in that respect. So this debate is going to continue within DSA, I think, for the foreseeable future. DSA, in my judgment, is the only viable socialist organization in the United States. Solidarity is very weak. There's no question about it. I think, even though I'm a member, I think its moment has passed. Most members of Solidarity are also in the DSA, including a lot of people who were around the Teamsters for Democratic Union, labor notes, so on and so forth. They're all in the DSA and participate in the left wing of the DSA.
So I wouldn't disagree with most of what Patrick has said. I will say that I do not typically have a serious understanding of most other socialist organizations that still exist. I would say that most people who have been in an older socialist organization in the country have cross-listed with DSA now. And it's almost like DSA has kind of consumed all other socialist orgs, and they're like within DSA, and now we're having these debates as DSA grows. just DSA is the only one who knocks on my door. Like for any of the other ones, I'd have to figure out how to even find that they exist, right? And that's true for most Americans, even more so than myself, because I'm already very, consider myself a socialist and like I'm very curious about this stuff, right? With Bernie Sanders, so he very much was much more radical when he came, started his political career. He ran, I don't remember the name of his party in Vermont, but in Burlington when he became mayor, he won with very few number of votes, and it was like Freedom and Liberation Party or some sort of minor party. It was only when he got to the Senate that he began working with Democrats. I will say, I think he both knows better, but also is intimately pragmatic. Bernie's old. He doesn't have that much time left. So if he's going to spend his last piece of time being the chairman of the budget committee and ramming through good shit with reconciliation process, which only requires 50 votes in the Senate, that's a good last move, right? Because there's really what else is he going to do? I mean, he could go to Latin America and meet with socialist leaders that won and try and have solidarity that way. But I think we all kind of don't have that much control, and a lot of it is kind of I think Patrick was also saying we kind of need a majority of people in the country to understand socialism and kind of at least agree on some vision or some path forward. And within DSA, as it's grown, I think we're at 100,000 or more now, members. But you can already see the infighting, and it's getting sad to watch, frankly. So I don't know if anybody went to the convention, but it's on display now, right? So I think DSA can also crumble in the future if it doesn't, we can't maintain a civil dialogue about these things. If we're calling each other, we're saying your actions are undermining what our goal is, and we just point at each other and say that, we're not going to have, results of any kind, I would say.
I just wanted to ask about the best way you guys know is just being this party for longest, how to completely facilitate these ideas with people that aren't in socialism or in, because I'm afraid these discussions will be only encapsulated within us and that have these views. And my family lives in Arkansas. That's personally a very hard place to even talk about this at all. So I was wondering just ways to make people more knowledgeable or facilitate discussion.
So I'll bring this back to DSA. I've been a member for the last couple of years as well on the labor committee. I haven't been attending meetings. That's actually, I believe, how we met probably.
Yep.
At a labor committee meeting. It's tough because I firmly don't believe you need to have a wide, well-read understanding of history or be in necessarily agreement about all the historical dynamics of socialism and capitalism to act politically, or to be able to organize for socialism, because that's just not going to happen. It's a question of chicken and the egg. How do we, inspire people to take action, but also have that action reflect itself in some kind of continuity history where we do need these historical insights, but we can't, if we premise political action on, historical insights and self-consciousness, we'll end up like a lot of the groups Platypus has had on panels, like the Spartacist League, which is very well read and very sectarian. They're very, tied to their interpretation of things, and their interpretation of a lot of things isn't wrong. It's just not. It just hasn't proven to be a model for political action. And without political action, you're not going to understand history, and you're not going to understand it. So, I really, am throwing my hands up in the air at this point. I mean, maybe DSA is one way to do it. Maybe it's labor organizing, and it's somehow having a concept of the history of how labor organizing has failed in America, how politics have failed, and trying to communicate those failures clearly, because the failures are obvious. So it's trying to connect the dots between what people have right in front of them and the next step.
I think the one thing that I would say is I think often the far left in aggregate spends a lot of time kind of punching the D party and trying to undermine them. And I think it's good to point out and criticize things, but there's a huge missed opportunity because we're fixating about the D party, but in reality, I think the largest opportunities for organizing and making inroads are in places where the D party is totally absent. So if you look at like rural Missouri, rural Arkansas, like there's even barely a nominal Republican Party in a lot of these places. It's very ripe for socialists to go and not only have conversations, but like build actual communities that are at least beginning to approximate things that we actually want to go for, right? So that's like community events, like, providing food, providing activities, like just building community in a way that it hasn't existed in the United States in a long time, particularly in these areas. And then through that trust, through that solidarity that you've developed, that's how you can begin to have that conversation about socialism. It's almost never, if I'm talking to somebody new that I open with socialism, right? I creep my way towards that with other conversations, and it makes it, they're much more receptive that way, I find.
Actually, I have a short question for Patrick, which I probably should have asked earlier, but earlier one of his remarks, Nick, brought up the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is Marx's term for a form of government in which socialist transformation of society could be undertaken. So I'm wondering about what you think of this concept, the dictatorship of proletariat, as the starting point of socialist revolution.
Well, I think the term is an abstract term. It means we should say dictatorship of the working class. And we shouldn't use dictatorship because that has a unpleasant connotation. We should say, how can we formulate this? That the democratic control of the working class, something like that. It should be used, because the dictatorship of the proletariat is an archaic formulation that goes back to when Karl Marx was talking about something in 1848 or so, in that respect. So we really should be talking about a much more pluralistic term, I think, in my judgment.
I want to agree really strongly real quick, because I think by tying ourselves constantly to terms that are old, right, just like ancient terms that really people don't understand today, the word dictatorship has taken on all kinds of connotation. And if you open up a conversation with somebody and you're like, we're going to talk about the DOP today, you've already lost them, right? It's like, oh boy, like dictatorship, that sounds like Stalin. And then we already are having trouble teasing the differences among normal people, right? So, I would strongly underscore what Patrick is saying. Is like, find new words. It's almost like a marketing exercise, but find new words that are better able to express what you actually mean to normal people, and through that you'll get there.
Actually, could I follow up?
Yeah, go ahead.
Ignoring this perhaps crass terminology of dictatorship and its poor marketing appeal to people, what do you understand as a dictatorship of the proletariat, and why? And if you agree with this idea of Marx's, in one of his letters to Joseph Weydemeyer, who was like the editor of Capital, he said was his only original contribution to political economy. If you agree with the dictatorship of the proletariat, then why do you think it's necessary?
Well, I agree with it if that means the prevalence of the working class. Let's put it that way. That if the working class really is the class that rules over society, as opposed to the present 1%, then yes, I do agree with that. I don't like the term dictatorship of proletariat for the same reasons that Nick and Gus have talked about. That it's a sort of an archaic term. But I think if we want to talk about something that, when we talk about revolution, we're talking about a transformation of the bottom rising up and replacing the top. And the pyramidal structure is, reversed, so to speak. If we turn the pyramid on its head and have the working class at the top, and then have the 1% at the bottom, that's what we're talking about.
But you had a question way back. Do you still have it?
Well, I guess kind of want to sort of tie a couple of things that have been talked about already. Like, if we're not, so I have a question with socialist leadership, right? And then this is now the question of like the dictator of the proletariat. And if like the entire, so like what's the difference between socialism and just like progressive states, right? So like if we're going to go to people in rural Arkansas and say, well, we're going to increase, the state through welfare budgets, or, so like the original idea of Marxism, right, is that like increasing the state is, the police state is the welfare state. It's the same as Lassalleanism. It's the same as Stalinism in that sense. Obviously, there's more or less authoritarian ways of doing it. But if the question of the leadership, so to speak, of the working class and the independent sort of socialist position, so I guess what I'm just kind of pointing to is like, I was struck by one of the things that Nick said at the beginning, like socialism as a bet on capitalism, as a bet on the sort of newness of the social relations. So if we can't imagine revolution anymore, like what is relevant? What are the relevant aspects of the counter-revolution? Because like from a Marxist perspective, one could say the entire FDR state, the Democratic Party, is the counter-revolution. It is a part of the larger counter-revolution. So if we can't imagine revolution, how can we imagine, like, okay, well, what are the obstacles in terms of the counter-revolution that we've been experiencing for a century? And then on the other hand, what are the possibly revolutionary implications of the conservatism of the working class? Because the working class is necessarily conservative in capitalism. So how do we get, yeah. I guess those are my key ideas. Because at the political level, we've been having a counter-revolution for at least a century. And the working class is conservative, but what about conservatism is still keeping capitalism going?
Okay, first of all, you're absolutely wrong that we haven't been enduring a century of counter-revolution. The FDR period in the 1930s was not a counter-revolution. Believe you me, you would know what a counter-revolution is, okay? If all these assholes that voted for Trump that are calling for, opposing any kind of progressive thing that's going on today, that's a counter-revolution, okay? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the unfortunate, hundreds of thousands of people that voted for Trump and still support Trump and maintain that Trump really won the election. That's a counter-revolution in that respect, and that has to be combated in any kind of way that combat activity is manifested. My two colleagues probably would like to respond to you too as well, but it has not been a period of counter-revolution, although it is very frightening that there are so many right-wing people in the United States today. When I first became active politically, the period of McCarthyism was just ending, and right now, I think it's more, there is a greater right-wing sector in the United States than there was back in 1960 when McCarthyism was ending. Why is that? That's a good question. You could say, in part, it's part of the Lee Atwater strategy of flipping the South after the Lyndon Johnson supported civil rights and had the civil rights legislation passed. Lee Atwater, a strategist for the Republican Party, saw that he could act upon this and transform the South. And almost instantaneously, it switched from being supporting the Democrats, as it had done for decades and decades, to supporting Republicans. And you've still found that to be the case. The working class in the northern industrial cities, in the Midwest and in the East, still remained progressive. Now that's no longer the case, and you have to ask yourself why. It's because I think fundamentally that the goods have not been delivered to them, that they're still, that wages have actually dropped, have gone down, for the white working class in the North. These are questions that really have to be asked, and what can be done about it. And I think that what Nick was talking about the union movement resuscitating itself is very important. The union movement now is weaker in terms of its percentage of the percentage of the working class being organized now. It's down. If you eliminate the public employee unions, it's down to about 3%. That's ridiculous. And that has to change tremendously if we're going to have to build a movement to struggle for progressive social change.
So I'm going to have to respectfully disagree, and I would agree with your point that the FDR era, the reforms were self-consciously counter-revolutionary. They were self-consciously a bulwark against radical, possible revolutionary elements in America. And they were tied, maybe not originally when the NLRA was passed, but certainly in the series of Supreme Court cases, and the whole reason the Southern Democrats voted for the Labor Act was because there was also revolt against any left-wing elements in labor unions and potential sources of organization in American society, and particularly after the conclusion of World War II. And you see that with the way the Taft-Hartley bill was passed in reaction to the wave of strikes at the end of World War II. And I don't feel like we should, need, or can hold up the welfare state as an example of socialism. And I do think, and let me say this, I think there's probably as many socialists who have at one point in time in the recent past identified as Republicans. Now maybe you're not going to get QAnon Viking who stormed the Capitol building interested in the ideas of, how do we organize politically to work less and get paid more. I mean, that's my simple way of explaining socialism. It doesn't have anything to do with the state necessarily. It's about the relationship of work and how that drives society. And I think being open with the criticism of the welfare state, people were pissed at how it turned out. It was wildly corrupt. Not only at home, but it was an integral part, the welfare state was an integral part of the war machine abroad. I mean, we spent $2 trillion improving the suburbs of Northern Virginia, the final tab for Afghanistan. And I do feel like, especially in these rural areas where there is manufacturing now where there wasn't before, and unions are trying and failing to organize these workers, they see what happened to the UAW. I mean, it was basically put into, sort of faux Western, faux IG Metall mold, where you have, a seat at the table, the stakeholders decide the fate of the company under capitalism. And what ultimately happened, they bought a ton of real estate on the Detroit River, they took out the organizers, put them in air conditioning, and then after a generation or two of that, they start spending tens of thousands, $100,000 on golf trips and, luxury, Louis Vuitton bags you can fit a body into while they're driving Land Rovers, not even union made, like to and from negotiations. So I think there's a lot of common ground we can find with people who identify as conservatives when we talk about the legacy of the welfare state and the notion of socialism not being statist. And certainly if you look at the historical model of best paid day, they organized their own schools and organizations and cooperatives and such. So using the state as, that is not necessarily a historically accurate representation of socialism at its peak.
I think 2 comments quickly. So it is important to understand that if you look at registered Democrats and registered Republicans, the number of Democrats that would say they're socialists just is much larger than Republicans. Republicans still typically have a very poor view of socialism, and it's not a good way to organize them. But you can get them to agree with socialist principles and socialist ideals through different means, and that's what I would suggest. The other thing that I would say is reforms are important. So it's true that both parties are managed and governed by the 1%, as is all of society. But we've made tremendous inroads in terms of challenging the D party, and it's time to make similar inroads with the Republican Party in a not batshit insane way. So when you're organizing for reforms, you essentially want to make it super clear that you are demanding this reform from the party in power in spite of the party and in opposition to its resistance, right? The party never reforms anything because it wanted to. It reforms it because it was demanded and forced.
Okay, so we've gone for about an hour 50 minutes. So what I'm going to do is ask each of you if you'd like to give closing remarks for 2 or 3 minutes each, and then we'll be done. Starting with Gus.
Oh man, I open and do the first close. No, that's okay. Let me see. So I think very good conversation today. I do encourage folks to try and talk to normal people about socialism. I think that's one of the biggest next steps. So literally go to Arkansas for a weekend and just hit 100 doors and just see what happens, because you learn a lot. It's very true that handing out that little piece of DSA lit is what turns people on to socialism the first time. If it has no Democratic Party branding, not even Bernie branding, it's its own thing, they're probably going to be more receptive to the ideas than otherwise. So I'd highly recommend that. I think we need to be spending way more time with that. In particular because, as some people have mentioned, the working class is trending very conservative, and they're trending very traditionalist in the same that Nick was kind of, alluding to. They're rejecting modernity and kind of the gains from it, and are also kind of scapegoating others for the problems caused by capitalism. So unless we talk to them and try and tease that out and try and make it clear that we are fellow workers, we are in solidarity with each other, and both parties are the problem, we're going to lose them. And then not only are we going to lose them, we're going to lose every, body at the federal level in Congress. So.
Well, what I would urge to all of you in the room is become active in some kind of struggle. There are all kinds of struggles going on, progressive struggles, and they need people to become active in them. So I would urge everybody here to become active in some kind of a struggle for progressive social change, period.
In closing, I would suggest, and this is going to be a cheap plug for Platypus, but if you haven't really had a chance to dig into the legacy of liberalism and the history of the American Revolution through the development of Marx and the development of socialism prior to 1917, I would strongly urge you to do so. There's free resources on the Platypus webpage with reading lists. It's not, it's not commentary. It's original source material linked on there. Because I think a lot of these questions, including these discussions with quote unquote normal people, and I would advise you not to give up that label for yourself. I might be strange in a lot of ways, but I'm going to be rather firm that my politics aren't that strange. Getting yourself acquainted with the connection between this shared history, and we live in the nation of America, become acquainted with the history and understand how it's connected. You're going to be able to make better arguments because it's the truth, or not the capital T truth, but it's a development from it. And socialism is a gamble. We're gambling that we can do something better than the society we have now. So I would suggest you make that argument and go from there. Other than that, I don't have any other suggestions for you. You're going to have to pay my retainer to get those.